Okay, guys, today we're going to be reviewing for our test over chapters 19 through 22. After this exam, which will be tomorrow, the day we get out for Thanksgiving, you will have one more exam over one more unit. Then you'll have your semester test, and besides your paper, which remember is due December the 11th, that will be the last grades that we have. Will be this test, the quizzes over chapters 23 through 26, the exam over chapters 23 through 26, and your final exam. Also, don't forget that blog 3 is due midnight of the day we come back from Thanksgiving break. So that will be, December the 2nd, I think it is, by midnight of that night. Okay, so let's talk about the exam that you're going to be having tomorrow over chapters 19 through 22. This unit was over different tissues. It was also over skeletal system, muscular system, circulatory system, and respiratory system. So quite a bit of information, but again, we just barely skimmed the surface of this. So in chapter 19, we talked about tissues. There are 4 types of tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. When it comes to epithelial tissue, we want to make sure that we know how to name those tissues. Remember, they are named based upon the number of layers and the cell shape. So if it has only one layer, it is said to be simple. If it has many layers, it is said to be stratified. The 3 basic shapes that we talked about were squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. So simple squamous would be one layer, again, of thin, flat, irregularly shaped cells. Simple cuboidal would be one layer of cube-shaped cells. Simple columnar would be one layer of tall, thin, narrow cells. Stratified squamous would be many layers of thin, flat, irregularly shaped cells. Stratified cuboidal would be many layers of cuboidal cells or cube-shaped cells. And stratified columnar would be many layers of tall, slender cells. Again, this kind of shows you some of these. Simple squamous here, one layer of thin cells. Simple cuboidal, one layer of cube-shaped cells. Simple columnar, one layer of tall, slender cells. Stratified squamous, many layers, with the superficial layers being thin and flat and irregularly shaped. Also, we talked about nerve tissue. You do need to know the parts of a neuron and what they do. So, for example, this is a neuron, the largest cell in the body. We see it has a cell body with a nucleus, dendrites that branch off that cell body, and an axon, which is like the wire, covered in the myelin sheath, which are these yellow globs, and then the axon terminals. Again, the dendrites receive the neurotransmitter from the previous nerve cell. The axon is like the wire. It conducts the electrical signal. The myelin sheath is a fatty insulation that covers the axon to help the electrical signal travel along the axon faster. And then the axon terminals release the neurotransmitter so that the electrical signal can be transmitted to the next cell in the series. Moving on, the 3 types of muscle tissue that we talked about were smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. You need to know differences between these 3 types of muscle tissue. So, for example, smooth muscle cells are the smallest of the 3, while skeletal muscle cells are the largest of the 3. Both smooth and cardiac are involuntary, meaning you do not have conscious control over them. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, meaning that you have conscious control over it. Smooth muscle has one nucleus. Each cell has one nucleus. It has no striations, whereas cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle both have striations. Smooth muscle cells are spindle-shaped or fusiform in shape. That basically means they're thick in the middle and kind of tapered on each end. Cardiac muscle cells are branched, and they have connections, these dark lines here, called intercalated discs that help to conduct the contraction smoothly across the entire muscle. And then locations, remember that smooth muscle is located in the walls of hollow organs and blood vessels. Cardiac muscle is located only in the heart, and skeletal muscle is located attached to bones. A little bit about connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most variable and most widely distributed type of tissue in our body of all 4 types. There are lots of different types, including blood, bone, and fat, as well as tendons and ligaments. So again, highly variable. And that would be the main information that you would need to know about the 4 types of tissue that we learned about. The skeletal system, we need to be familiar with the bones and the organs they protect, because remember, that is one major function of our skeletal system, besides the fact that it kind of holds us up, supports our body and helps us move. It also protects organs. Our cranium protects our skull. Our vertebral column protects our spinal cord. Our rib cage protects our heart and lungs. Our pelvic bones help to protect some of those internal abdominal organs. Sections of the vertebral column you can see here in this picture. You have your cervical in your neck, thoracic behind the chest, lumbar in the lower back, sacrum, and then the coccyx is the tailbone. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. Again, cervicis, if you've been in medical terminology, cervicis means neck, thoracic refers to chest, lumbar refers to loin or lower back, and then sacrum is kind of between the hips right here, and then the coccyx is the tailbone. We also need to be familiar with some risk factors for osteoporosis. I've always said I'm a walking billboard for osteoporosis. Postmenopausal, thin, white, female with a family history. Some other risk factors that I don't have are drinking increases the risk, smoking increases the risk, drinking too many colas, carbonated beverages. Now, I do that, but drinking alcohol also increases the risk. And then that would be the main information I would expect you to know for the skeletal system. The muscular system, we need to be familiar with what are antagonistic pairs. Remember, antagonistic pairs are pairs of muscles that work, that oppose one another. They do opposite actions on the same body part. An example, the biceps brachii on the front part of our upper arm flexes the forearm or brings it up toward the shoulder. The triceps brachii then, when it contracts, it extends the forearm or brings it back down to its original position. Again, we must have antagonistic pairs because muscles are only able to pull. They shorten a muscle and pull the bone. They cannot push. So the same muscle cannot both bring the forearm up and push it back down. Muscles cannot push, they can only pull. What is a motor unit? Remember, a motor unit includes a neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates, that it controls. So small motor units, like in our fingers, have very few muscle fibers. This gives us a lot of control so that we can pick up small objects, but we can't get very much tension. So you can't pick up a 100-pound weight with your fingers. Large motor units include a neuron and many hundreds or thousands of muscle fibers. With these motor units, we don't get a lot of precise control. For example, in our stomach or our thigh, we can't pick up a small object, but we can generate a lot of force, which allows us to lift our body, for example. And then the parts and events of muscle contraction. Remember that basically calcium attaches to a regulatory protein on the thin filament called troponin. When calcium attaches to troponin, this moves another regulatory protein called tropomyosin out of the way on the active sites of actin. Actin is the major portion of the thin filament. When the active sites are exposed, when tropomyosin is moved, the active sites on actin are exposed. This allows the head or cross bridge of the thick filament, which is made up of myosin, so that the myosin head is able to attach to the active site on actin. And then those myosin heads pivot, and when they pivot, they pull the thin filament past the thick filament toward the center of the sarcomere, which shortens the sarcomere and shortens the muscle fiber and the muscle, and that's what causes contraction. So again, calcium attaches to troponin. Troponin moves tropomyosin away from actin's active site so that the myosin heads can bind to the active sites on the actin. The myosin heads then pivot, and this pulls the thin actin filament past the thick myosin filament and shortens the muscle fiber and causes contraction. In order to release, remember, ATP must bind to the myosin head. If no ATP is present, then the myosin heads cannot release, and this is what causes rigor mortis, or the stiffening of the muscles a few hours after death. We also need to be familiar with muscle fatigue. Again, muscle fatigue is caused by anaerobic respiration, so when you're working your muscle really hard and there's not enough oxygen, then the muscle will respire anaerobically to produce energy. This also ends up producing lactic acid, which builds up in the muscle cell and causes cramps, and this is what we call muscle fatigue. We also need to know, and that was all you need to know about the muscular system. Also with muscle contraction, I know that's a little bit involved, so you may go back and watch one or two of the videos that I showed on the video during that unit, during that part, to help you remember what happens during muscle contraction. Moving on to the circulatory system, the parts of the blood, we have red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. It contains antibodies as well as dissolved gases and nutrients. The red blood cells are red because they contain the protein hemoglobin that binds oxygen. So red blood cells carry oxygen and some carbon dioxide. White blood cells are immune cells. They fight infection. Your T cells and B cells that we talked about with the immune system, those are white blood cells. And then the platelets contain enzymes that help the blood to clot, to keep you from bleeding to death when you have an injury. The types of blood vessels and what they do. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, generally speaking. Veins carry blood toward the heart, generally speaking. And then capillaries are the very tiny vessels that permeate all your tissues. They are so small in places that only one red blood cell at a time can fit through them. And the capillaries are where the oxygen and nutrients are exchanged for carbon dioxide and waste. So in the tissues, carbon dioxide and waste diffuse into the blood from the tissues to be carried away. And then oxygen and nutrients diffuse out of the blood into the tissues to nourish the tissues and keep them alive. You need to be familiar with blood flow through the heart. We'll start right here with the right atrium. Remember, when you're looking at a picture of the heart, your left side is the heart's right side because it's backward when you're facing it. So blood comes in from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. It goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes through the pulmonic valve into the lungs. The left and right pulmonary arteries carry blood to the lungs. In the lungs, carbon dioxide is given out, and you breathe that out. Oxygen diffuses into the blood. So on the left side of the heart, we have deoxygenated blood. This is dirty blood coming in from the body. It contains very little oxygen. And from the right side of the heart, it travels to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Once it has picked up oxygen, it will travel back in through the left and right pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The left atrium, from the left atrium, it will then go through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it will go through the aortic valve into the aorta to be distributed to the entire body. So this is the oxygenated. This is the reason why this side is red. The left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumps it out to the entire body so that oxygen can be carried to the tissues to keep the cells alive. And the blood is carried through the aorta to the body. After the circulatory system, we talked about the respiratory system. We need to be familiar with the pathway of air through the respiratory system. So remember, you breathe air in through your nose and mouth. It enters your pharynx and then down into your larynx. Your larynx, remember, is your voice box. This is where your vocal cords are located. Again, there is an epiglottis there. When you swallow, it blocks off the trachea, which is your windpipe, so that food and water do not go down the windpipe. They go down the esophagus, which is posterior to your trachea. So the air goes nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, then into bronchi. Those are these two larger tubes here. The trachea branches into two bronchi, and then inside the lungs, the bronchi branch into bronchioles, which are smaller tubes. At the end of the bronchioles, we have these little structures that look like clusters of grapes. They are called alveoli. It is the alveoli surrounded by capillaries where the carbon dioxide diffuses out to be breathed away, and the oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the capillaries to oxygenate the blood. The other thing we need to know about the respiratory system is pressure and volume and how they are involved during respiration. Remember, when you inhale, your intercostal muscles and diaphragm contract. This expands your lungs and your chest cavity, which basically means we have an increased volume. Increased volume means decreased pressure, and that decreased pressure compared to the higher pressure outside kind of pulls air into the lungs. When you breathe out, just the opposite happens. The intercostal muscles and diaphragm relax. The volume in your lungs and your chest cavity decreases. That increases the pressure and pushes the air back out during exhalation. Lastly, we talked about the immune system. We need to be familiar with the differences between adaptive and innate immunity. Remember, innate immunity is what you were born with. It is not specific. It targets anything that's not supposed to be there. It includes things like non-specific cells like macrophages, natural killer cells. It also includes things like your skin, your mucous membranes, your acid in your stomach, things like that. It also includes things like fever, inflammation. The adaptive immune system is specific. It is targeted towards specific pathogens. It includes both your T cells and B cells, which would be cell-mediated immunity and antibody-mediated immunity. We actually, in our lecture, we divided innate immunity into two things, and we talked about three lines of defense: the physical, chemical, mechanical barriers, which would be this part; the innate, which we call this part; and then the adaptive, which would be both cell-mediated and antibody-mediated. Again, our physical, chemical, mechanical barriers, that includes things like our skin is a physical barrier. The chemical barriers would be antibacterial enzymes in our saliva, in our tears, acid in our stomach, mucus in our respiratory, reproductive, digestive tracts. And then our innate, we said, was things like our fever, our inflammation, also your monocytes and macrophages, your neutrophils, your natural killer cells, those cells that are nonspecific, they just kind of gobble up anything that comes along. Remember, those neutrophils are the first ones at the scene of the injury or infection, and they gobble up pathogens and then they die, whereas the macrophages can gobble up pathogens and they don't die. They just keep eating and eating and eating. And then our adaptive, again, is our T cells and B cells, our antibody-mediated and cell-mediated immunity. Going into those two, your humoral or antibody-mediated immunity is carried out by B cells. They secrete antibodies as well as have antibodies on their surface, and they primarily work against extracellular pathogens. Your cell-mediated is carried out by your T cells. It does not involve antibodies. It involves direct cell-to-cell contact or cytokines, which are chemicals that are secreted. And it is primarily involved in defense against intracellular pathogens, so your own body cells that have been infected by a parasite or a virus, for example. You do need to be very familiar with immunity. Your open response will be about the immune system, so you need to be familiar with those three lines of defense: the physical, chemical, mechanical barriers, which would basically be all this stuff; the innate, which would be things like our nonspecific cells, like our neutrophils, macrophages, natural killer cells, as well as our fever and inflammation; and then the adaptive would be this stuff right here. It would be this stuff right here as well, both your humoral and cell-mediated immunity. I won't be here today, or I'm not here today, I'm sorry, because I had some tests at the hospital to have done. But if you have any questions, please just email me or send me a message on Google Classroom or something like that, and I'll try to answer any questions that you have. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.